I'm writing this because I don't know how much longer we can stay sane. 3 generations of my family have worked this land in the mountains of Montana, and now we're seriously talking about walking away from all of it. Not because of debt, not because of drought, not because of anything a banker or a neighbor or a county assessor would understand. We're thinking about abandoning our home, our heritage, everything we built with our own hands, because something in the woods has decided we don't belong here. Something that leaves 18-inch footprints in the mud outside our children's bedroom window. The morning I'm thinking about right now, the one I keep coming back to, was so ordinary it almost hurts to remember it. October, early, maybe 6 in the morning, and the sky over the Beartooth foothills was doing that thing it does in fall, where the light comes in low and gold and makes everything look like it belongs on a postcard. I was standing on the porch with my coffee, watching the horses move slowly across the lower pasture, and for a moment I had this feeling that we'd actually done it, that we'd built the life we'd talked about for years around a kitchen table in a Denver apartment. Me and Sarah, neither of us with any real idea what we were getting into. We'd bought the ranch 4 years before this story starts. 320 acres outside a small town in Carbon County, Montana, tucked into a fold of land where 2 ridgelines came together, and a creek ran down through stands of lodgepole pine and Engelmann spruce that stretched for miles in every direction. The nearest neighbor was 11 miles by road. The nearest town of any size was 35 miles. We knew that going in. We wanted it. We were tired of traffic and noise and neighbors who never looked at you, and we wanted space and silence and the kind of work that leaves your hands dirty and your body tired in a way that feels honest. For 3 years, we got exactly what we wanted. Sarah ran the vegetable operation and a small flock of laying hens. I managed the cattle, about 40 head of mixed Angus and Hereford, and did custom haying work for some of the other ranchers in the valley to bring in extra cash. We homeschooled our 2 kids, Danny, who was 9 that fall, and Lily, who was 7, and they spent their days outside in a way that city kids never get to, catching frogs in the creek and building forts in the hay barn, and learning the names of every bird that came through the property. That morning on the porch, the October morning I started with, Sarah came out behind me and leaned against my shoulder, and we just stood there for a few minutes, watching the horses. She smelled like coffee and that lavender soap she'd been buying from a woman at the farmer's market. I put my arm around her. Everything was fine, except the dogs weren't at the fence line. We had 2 border collies, Hatch and Rue, and every morning without fail, they ran the fence line along the east pasture while I drank my coffee. It was their routine, as reliable as sunrise. I noticed their absence the way you notice a clock that stopped. Not right away, but after a moment when the wrongness of the silence catches up to you. I looked around the yard. Both dogs were pressed against the foundation of the house, side by side, completely still, staring at the tree line at the north end of the property, where the lodgepole pines came right up to our fence. Sarah noticed me looking. She looked too. Neither of us said anything. I told myself it was probably a deer. Deer came through that corner of the property all the time, and the dogs had always been more curious than aggressive about them. I told myself that, and I drank the rest of my coffee and went inside to start the day. That night, after dinner, after the kids were in bed, I went out to do my final check on the cattle, and I found 3 of the fence posts along the north pasture pushed completely over. Not broken, not rotted through. Pushed over, the posts angled away from the tree line at the same angle, all 3 of them, like something had walked along the fence from the outside and leaned against it with its full weight without slowing down. The first sheep disappeared on a Tuesday. We ran a small flock, 14 ewes and 2 rams, kept mostly for Sarah's wool project, and when I did the morning count and came up 1 short, I spent 2 hours walking the perimeter, looking for a gap in the fence. Found nothing. No blood, no wool on the wire, no tracks that made sense in the frost-hardened ground. I logged it as a coyote kill and moved on. By the end of that week, we were down 4. Same pattern every time. No evidence of a struggle, no remains, nothing to tell me what direction the animal had gone or what had taken it. Coyotes don't work that clean. Mountain lions leave a drag mark, a smear of blood, something. Whatever was taking our sheep was removing them completely, and that bothered me in a way I couldn't quite put into words. A low-frequency unease I kept pushing back down because there was always more work to do. The cattle started acting wrong around the same time. My Angus are not excitable animals. They're big and slow-tempered, and they handle weather and predator pressure without much visible reaction. So when I started finding the whole herd bunched at the south end of the pasture every morning, as far from the north fence line as they could get, pressed together in a tight group with their heads all pointed the same direction, I paid attention. Cattle bunch when they're scared. They face the threat. Whatever they were facing, I couldn't see it. Sarah was the one who said it first. We were eating dinner, and she put her fork down and looked at me and said, "The animals know something." Just like that, flat and direct, the way she talks when she's already thought something through and decided it's true. I said I didn't disagree. We sat with that for a minute, and then Danny asked if he could have more potatoes, and we let it go. The smell started about 3 weeks after the first sheep went missing. I don't know how to describe it to someone who hasn't encountered it. It wasn't decay exactly, though there was something rotten underneath it. It was musky and animal and very strong, with a sharp chemical edge that made the inside of your nose feel like you'd inhaled something caustic. It came from the north, from the direction of the trees, and on still mornings it would hang in the cold air for an hour before fading. Sarah said it made her feel sick. I said it smelled like something big had been marking territory. She looked at me and didn't say anything, and I understood from her expression that she'd already considered that possibility, and it was why she was scared. The morning I first saw it, I'd been up since 4 doing a calving check on one of my late heifers. She'd delivered without trouble, and I'd settled her and the calf in the barn, and I was walking back to the house through the dark with my headlamp switched off, because the moon was bright enough to navigate by. I was 50 yards from the tree line at the north fence when I stopped. There was something standing between 2 spruce trees just inside the edge of the forest. I stopped because my body stopped before my brain gave the order, some ancient involuntary process that operates faster than thought, and its only instruction was, "Do not move." I stood in the frost-dry grass with the moonlight on the snow-dusted hills, and I looked at it, and I tried to process what I was seeing. It was standing upright. That was the first thing, the thing that didn't fit, because nothing that size stood upright on 2 legs. I estimated it at 8 feet, maybe more, and it was broad across the shoulders in a way that made it look like it had been built by someone who'd never seen a human being and was working from a rough description. It was covered in dark fur or hair, matted and long, and its arms hung at its sides with its hands near its knees. Its head was wide and set low on its shoulders with almost no neck visible. And it was completely still. Not the stillness of an animal that's been startled and is deciding whether to run. The stillness of something that had been standing there for a long time and was comfortable standing there, watching. I don't know how long we looked at each other. Long enough for the cold to work through my jacket. Long enough for my hands to start shaking. The shaking started in my fingers and worked up into my arms, and I had this strange, dissociated thought that I needed to grip something, that I needed something solid in my hands, and I realized I'd left my rifle in the barn. The creature's eyes caught the moonlight once, a brief amber flash, like reflective tape on a road sign. Then it stepped backward into the dark between the trees without making a sound, and it was gone. I stood there for another 5 minutes. My heart was going so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I finally walked to the house, my legs felt like the bones had been replaced with something softer. I sat at the kitchen table in the dark for a long time before I went upstairs, and when I finally lay down next to Sarah, I stared at the ceiling and listened to the house and didn't sleep until well after sunrise. I didn't tell her what I'd seen for 3 days. I told myself I was processing. The truth was I was testing my own memory, waiting to see if the image would soften or blur the way dream images do, waiting to find the rational explanation that would make the whole thing fit back inside my understanding of the world. The image didn't soften. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see it exactly: the width of those shoulders, the length of those arms, the way it had stood there with the patient, terrible stillness of something that had no reason to be afraid of anything in these woods. On the 4th day, I came home from moving the cattle to find Sarah standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed and her face doing the thing it does when she's holding something in. She told me she'd seen something at the south end of the creek that morning while she was checking the irrigation shutoff. Something tall, she said. Something that walked upright. Something that watched her from the far bank for almost a minute before disappearing into the willows. She said it wasn't a bear. She said she'd grown up in Wyoming. She'd seen bears her whole life, and this wasn't a bear. She said it looked at her the way a person looks at you. Not with the flat, reflexive attention of an animal, but with something focused and evaluating. Something that felt like consideration. We sat down and told each other everything. That night, after we talked, I went out to the barn to lock up, and I swept my flashlight across the north fence line out of habit. The beam caught something at the tree line, white against the dark. I walked to the fence and shone the light through the wire. It was a sheep's skull, cleaned and dry, set upright in the fork of a low branch with its empty eye sockets facing the house. I started keeping a record after that. Dates, times, locations, descriptions. I told myself it was practical, that if I needed to make a report, I'd want specifics. But the truth was that writing things down gave me the feeling of doing something, and I needed that feeling badly, because the actual options available to me were not satisfying. We found tracks for the first time that week, proper tracks in the mud along the creek bank, after 2 days of rain had softened the ground. I know animal tracks. I've been reading ground signs since I was a boy, following my father around this kind of country, and these were not anything I'd seen before. They were bipedal, a heel-toe pattern with 5 toes, almost human in shape, but scaled to a size that had no human equivalent. The longest one measured 17 inches. The depth of the impression told me about the weight behind it, and the weight behind it was considerable, more than any man, more than most animals I could think of that walked on 2 legs in Montana in the 21st century. The stride length between prints was just over 5 feet. I measured it twice. There were 2 sets of tracks, one large, the same size as the prints near the fence, and one smaller, maybe 12 inches, following along the same line about 2 feet to the right. 2 of them walking together along the bank of our creek, 40 yards from the back of our house. I didn't sleep that night. Sarah started the camera project. She ordered 4 trail cameras online, the kind with no-glow infrared, and we set them up at the corners of the property where we'd seen the most activity, mounted on fence posts and trees, angled to cover the approaches from the forest. We checked them every morning. For the first 4 days, they showed nothing useful. Deer, a raccoon, once a coyote that moved through the north pasture at 2 in the morning and stopped and looked at something off camera for a full 30 seconds before running. Running hard, not trotting. Running with its tail flat, the way dogs run when something has genuinely frightened them. On the 5th night, the camera at the north fence disappeared. Not fell, not malfunctioned. The mounting strap was still attached to the post. The camera was gone, unclipped cleanly, taken. The second camera at the creek crossing was still in place, but when we pulled the card, we found that the lens had been covered. Something had pressed a handful of mud over the lens at some point in the night, a deliberate, precise action, applied from the front of the camera, which meant whatever did it had been standing directly in front of the camera in the dark, close enough to reach the lens, and had covered it without triggering a recording. The third camera had been moved.
It was still mounted to the tree, but it had been rotated on its strap, so it faced directly into the bark, recording nothing. The fourth camera gave us a single image before it stopped functioning. A still frame from 2:17 in the morning. The frame showed the south tree line and the lower pasture, and at the very edge of the frame, partially obscured by a fence post, the lower portion of something standing upright. You could see from mid-thigh to the ground. The legs were heavily built, covered in dark hair, and the feet were bare in the November mud, and they were enormous. That was all. One frame, then a corrupted card with no recoverable data. I drove to the hardware store in town and bought 3 more cameras and a lockbox for each one. I mounted them myself, ran the straps through the lockbox hasps, padlocked them. I told myself that would be enough. That same afternoon, I went into the north pasture to check the fence and found the markers for the first time. I'd heard of this kind of thing. I'd read about it late at night on my phone after the first sighting, reading everything I could find about people who'd experienced what we were experiencing. And the markers were consistent with what others had described. Structures built from natural materials, branches twisted and broken and interwoven in patterns that could not happen by accident or weather. A cairn of stones balanced in a column 5 rocks high in the middle of a flat field, with no stones anywhere nearby, which meant the stones had been carried there from the creek bed. A spiral of small bones pressed into the mud in a perfect circle about 3 feet across. I stood in the pasture looking at the spiral, and the cold was working through my jacket, and the trees were very still, and the cattle were all at the far end of the field, and I had the absolute certain sensation of being watched from the tree line. Not suspected, not imagined, absolutely certain. The way you're certain of heat when you put your hand near a flame. I turned and walked back to the house quickly. I did not run. I knew, with a clarity I couldn't have explained, that running would change something about the dynamic, and I did not want to change it. That night, I called the county sheriff's office and the Fish and Wildlife Service and described large predator activity near the house, livestock losses, evidence of a significant animal presence near our property. A deputy came out the next day, walked the fence line, looked at the tracks, looked at the cairn, wrote things in a notebook. He said it might be a bear, a big one, maybe a problem animal that had lost its fear of humans. I showed him the stride length I'd measured, 6 feet between prints. He looked at his notebook for a moment. He said he'd file a report. He was backing out of the driveway when I heard the first knock from the north woods. 3 heavy impacts, wood on wood, resonant enough to feel in my chest at 100 yards. Then a pause. Then 3 more. The deputy stopped his truck. He sat there for a moment with his window down. Then he drove away without looking back, and I stood in my driveway watching his dust settle and listening to the silence that came after the knocking stopped.
which was the loudest silence I have ever heard. The knocking became part of the nights. It would start around 2 in the morning, sometimes earlier, sometimes later, and it would go on for 20 minutes or an hour, or sometimes until almost dawn. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, answered from a different direction, answered again from a third. We lay in bed listening to it, and the sound went through the walls and into the mattress, and I could feel Sarah's breathing change each time it started. Feel her go rigid beside me. Feel her hand find my arm in the dark. The children heard it. Danny asked me one morning at breakfast what the knocking sound was. I told him it was probably a woodpecker. He looked at me, the way 9-year-old boys look at you when they know you're not being straight with them, and went back to his cereal. Lily didn't say anything. She'd become quiet over the previous 2 weeks in a way that worried me more than Danny's questions. She'd started bringing her stuffed animals to the table at meals, lining them up beside her plate, and she wouldn't go to the bathroom at night without Sarah walking her. The barn incident happened on a night when the knocking had been going for almost 3 hours. I'd been lying awake listening to it and tracking where the sound was coming from. North Woods, South Ridge, East Creek Draw, triangulating, trying to count how many there were by the voices. Because by then, I'd accepted that the knocking was communication, that it was a form of language whose content I could not parse, but whose existence I could not deny. My best count was 4. At 3:40 in the morning, Hatch and Rue started screaming. Not barking, screaming. A sound I hadn't known dogs could make, high and continuous and raw. The sound of animals in the presence of something they understood at a cellular level to be outside the ordinary order of things. I was out of bed with the rifle in my hands before Sarah had fully woken up. I told her to stay with the kids and lock the bedroom door. She grabbed my arm as I was leaving and held it for 1 second and looked at me without saying anything. And I said, "I'll be right back," and I went. The motion light had come on over the barn doors. The yard was bright and empty. Hatch and Rue were in the barn already. I could hear them, could hear the sound their claws made on the concrete floor as they threw themselves against the inside of the barn door. The barn door was standing open 4 inches, the latch bar lifted, which I had latched myself 2 hours earlier. I pushed the door open the rest of the way with my shoulder, rifle up, and I went inside. The smell hit me the moment I entered, that heavy, rotten musk smell, but concentrated, filling the space, thick enough to taste at the back of my throat. The horses were in their stalls at the far end, and they were in a state I'd never seen horses in, pressed into the back corners of their stalls, with their eyes white all around, their nostrils flared huge, making this low, continuous sound that I can only describe as a whimper, a sound that horses do not make, a sound I don't have proper language for. I swept the flashlight across the barn in a slow arc. Tack room, clear. Feed room, clear. Hay storage, clear. Tool wall, clear. I let the beam travel to the rear of the barn, past the horse stalls, to the area behind the last stall where we kept the old equipment. It was back there, crouched, which still made it almost as tall as me standing, tucked into the space between the cultivator and the back wall. The flashlight caught the hair first, coarse and dark and matted, then the shape of a massive shoulder, then the arm, which was resting on the cultivator's frame, and the hand, the enormous hand, gripping the metal of the frame with fingers that were thicker than my wrist. Its head turned toward me. The eyes caught the light and threw it back amber, and for 3 full seconds we looked at each other in the beam of my flashlight in my barn at 4 in the morning, and I want to tell you that I raised the rifle and held my ground, but what I actually did was stop breathing. My body just stopped breathing, and my vision went very bright at the edges, and the rifle in my hands felt like something I had forgotten how to use. It stood up. When it stood up fully in the back of my barn, The top of its head was 18 inches below the roof beams, and the width of its shoulders filled the space between the stall wall and the cultivator, and it looked at me from that height, with those eyes, and made a sound that I will never find the right word for. Low and resonant and modulated, a sound with shape and intention to it, a sound that felt less like a vocalization and more like a physical pressure in the center of my chest. Then it turned and walked through the back wall of the barn, not through the door, which was 3 feet to its left, through the wall. The boards split, and the frame groaned, and it was gone into the dark, and the cold outside air came rushing in through the hole it left, and the horses screamed, actually screamed this time, a sound I had never heard from them before, and hoped never to hear again. I stood in my barn for a long time, before my legs agreed to carry me back to the house. When I got inside, Sarah was in the kitchen with all the lights on and a knife in her hand, and when she saw my face, she put the knife down on the counter very carefully and came and put her arms around me and held on. In the morning I went out to look at the hole in the back wall. The boards were old pine, an inch thick, and they had been broken outward as cleanly as if something had walked through them at a steady pace without slowing or bracing. The hole was 7 feet tall and 4 feet wide. Around the edges, caught on the splinters, there were tufts of dark, coarse hair about 6 inches long. I pulled several free and put them in a plastic bag. I still have that bag. I don't know what I'll do with it. 2 weeks after the barn, Danny and Lily saw the small one. They'd been playing in the yard in the middle of the afternoon, a bright, cold day. Sarah and I both visible from the yard, me working on the tractor 30 feet away, and Sarah weeding the cold frames near the garden fence. Everything normal, everything ordinary, both adults present, full daylight. I want to be clear about that because what happened in conditions under which nothing should have been able to happen. I heard Lily say, "Danny, look." Not scared, curious. That particular tone children have when they've found something interesting. I looked up and saw both kids standing still near the garden fence, looking toward the east side of the property, where an old apple orchard ran along the fence line, 6 or 7 gnarled trees my grandfather planted that still produced a small crop every fall. Between 2 of the trees, standing partly behind a trunk, was something small. Small is relative. It was probably 4.5 feet tall, which would make it roughly the same height as Danny. It was covered in the same coarse, dark hair as the others, but lighter in color, more reddish-brown, almost auburn where the sun caught it. Its proportions were similar to the large one, but less extreme. The arms not quite as disproportionately long, the head not quite as wide. It was watching the children with its head tilted to one side, and it was copying them. Danny had lifted his hand, not waving, just raised it slightly, a half gesture of acknowledgement, the way you greet someone across a distance. And the small creature had its hand raised the same way, the same height, the same angle, mirroring him. Lily took a step to the left. The creature took a step to the left. Danny crouched down to pick something up from the ground, a stick or a stone, and the creature crouched in exact mimicry. Sarah was beside me, and her hand found my arm, and her grip was very tight. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. I understood without either of us saying it that moving quickly might change something, that this moment had a particular quality of fragile equilibrium that any sudden action could shatter. The creature stood back up when Danny stood up. It looked at both children for another moment. Then it looked at me, directly at me, across 40 yards of frosted grass. It looked at me with dark, intelligent eyes that held no expression I could name. Then it stepped backward behind the apple tree, and it was gone. Danny walked back to me and said, "Dad, what was that?" I said I didn't know. He said it was copying us. I said, "Yes, I saw." He thought about this for a moment and then said, "Is it young?
Like us? I told him I thought maybe it was. He nodded like that made sense to him, and went back to what he'd been doing. Lily didn't say anything. She came and stood next to Sarah and held her hand, and looked at the apple trees for a long time. That evening I drove to town and went to the Fish and Wildlife Regional Office, which was closing for the day, and I sat in the parking lot until the ranger I recognized, the younger one who'd come out when we first reported the fence damage, walked out to his truck. I got out and stopped him, and I told him everything. All of it, no edits, no careful framing to avoid sounding crazy. The tracks, the cameras, the barn, the children, and the small creature in the orchard. He listened to all of it without interrupting me, and when I finished, he stood there in the parking lot in the early dark and looked at his truck keys for a long time. Then he said they'd had 11 reports from this valley in the past 6 years. Ranchers and homesteaders, same patterns, livestock losses without evidence, property damage that didn't match known animals, sightings of large bipedal figures in the tree lines. He said the official position was bear and wolf activity. He said the unofficial position was something he wasn't authorized to share. He said the one thing all the reports had in common was that the activity followed a progression, that it escalated in a consistent pattern, and then it stopped. I asked him what made it stop. He said every single family that filed multiple reports had sold and moved within 18 months of the first sighting. Every single one. He said, as far as anyone could document, activity on a given property ceased when the human occupants vacated. I asked him what that meant. He said, they scare people off. He said they're patient about it. He said they have been here longer than the property lines, and longer than the survey stakes, and longer than any family that has ever tried to hold land in these hills. He said they start slow because they don't need to rush. He said, and he said this quietly and looked away when he said it, that in his experience, they always finish what they start. He gave me his card and told me to call if we needed anything, and he got in his truck and drove away. And I stood in the empty parking lot with the mountains dark against the sky and the cold coming down off them. And I understood for the first time in this whole long nightmare exactly what was happening to us. Not what. I mean, I'd known what for months. Why. I finally understood why. And understanding it didn't help at all. We told the kids we were moving at the end of November. Danny took it better than I expected. He asked if he could bring his chickens, and I said yes, and he said, okay. Lily cried for about an hour and then went quiet and started helping Sarah organize boxes, working steadily and without complaint, like she just wanted to be done and out. We called a realtor in Billings. We started packing. We sold what livestock we couldn't transport. I patched the barn wall, not because I thought it would hold anything, but because I couldn't look at that hole anymore. The moment we listed the property, the activity stopped. Not gradually, not a slow tapering off. Overnight. The knocking went silent. The horses stood calmly in their pasture for the first time in months. Hatch and Rue ran the fence line in the morning. The smell was gone. The footprints we checked the creek bank every day out of habit found nothing new. The tree line at the north end of the property looked like a tree line, just trees, just ordinary Montana forest in winter. Sarah said it was a good sign. I didn't say anything. Our last night on the property was the second week of December, clear and very cold, 20 below at midnight, the kind of cold that makes the timbers of an old house tick and groan. We'd sold most of the furniture, and we were sleeping on air mattresses in the living room, the 4 of us together,
and the kids fell asleep quickly from the physical exhaustion of the last packing push. Sarah fell asleep with her arm around Lily. I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. At some point past midnight, I got up. I don't know what woke me. Not a sound exactly, more a change in the quality of the silence, a density to it, the particular stillness of the house the night the barn happened. I got up and I stood in the dark living room for a moment, and then I walked to the front door. The motion light over the porch was on. I stood at the door and looked through the glass panel. The porch was covered in a thin skin of new snow, maybe a quarter-inch that had fallen in the last hour. The snow was white and undisturbed across the porch decking and the 2 steps down to the yard, and the yard itself, except for the prints. One set, coming from the north, crossing the yard, climbing the porch steps, coming all the way to the door, not circling the house, not approaching from a cautious distance, straight to the door, as if it had walked to the front of the house and stood there, in the snow, at the door, maybe a foot from where I was standing, and then turned around and walked back the way it had come.
I stood at the door with my hand flat on the wood, and I looked at those prints for a long time. I thought about what the ranger had said, that they always finish what they start. I thought about the small creature in the orchard, the way it had mirrored Danny's movement, the intelligence in it, the patience. I thought about 11 other families in this valley in 6 years. I thought about the fact that the tracks came to the door and stopped, not because it had turned back, not because something had frightened it, but because it had done what it came to do. It had stood at our door in the last hours we occupied this house, and it had listened to us breathe, and it had known we were leaving, and it had come to confirm it. It didn't want inside. It never wanted inside. It wanted us out. We left the next morning, loaded the last of the boxes into the truck, locked the doors, drove down the county road, and turned toward Billings. I watched the property in the rearview mirror until the tree line disappeared behind a ridge, and then I faced forward and drove. That was 8 months ago. We live in a rented house in Missoula now, a subdivision, neighbors on both sides, streetlights, all of it. The kids are in school, and Danny has made friends, and Lily has started talking again, really talking, the way she used to before any of this happened. Sarah sleeps through the night most nights. There are weeks now when the whole thing feels like something that happened to someone else, something I read about or dreamed. Last week I drove Danny to his soccer practice on the other side of town, a route I hadn't taken before, and on the way back I passed a park that borders a long strip of undeveloped land, a greenway, the city kind, trees and brush along a drainage corridor that runs for miles through the northwest part of Missoula. I was stopped at a light next to the park, and I happened to look out my window. There was something standing in the trees at the far edge of the park, back in the shadow where the ornamental lighting didn't reach. Standing still, completely still. In that way I know now. In that way I will recognize for the rest of my life. It was there for maybe 4 seconds while the light was red, and then I was moving, and it was gone behind me. I drove the rest of the way home with both hands tight on the wheel, and the heat turned all the way up, and I couldn't get warm. When I got inside, I hugged Danny for a long time, and he asked me what was wrong, and I told him nothing. I told him everything was fine. I don't know what it was doing in that park. I don't know if it was the same one, or one of the others, or something else entirely. I don't know if it followed us here, or if it was always here, already in these trees, already watching this neighborhood, this street, this house, the way they were already in the hills around our ranch before we ever arrived. I don't know if we escaped. I'm not sure escape was ever the option they were offering us. I'm not sure it still isn't. If this story got under your skin the way it got under mine putting it together, hit that subscribe button. Because this is what we do here. We find the accounts that don't make the news.
The ones that get filed under probable bear activity and forgotten in some county drawer, and we put them in front of you, unfiltered. Every week, there's another story from someone who moved to a remote property and found out too late that the land had prior occupants who didn't leave a forwarding address. You don't want to miss what's coming next. And before you go, leave a comment. Tell me where you're watching from. Tell me if you've got trees behind your house right now. And tell me the last time you actually looked at them. I mean, really looked. Not just glanced, but stood there and watched the dark between the trunks for long enough to be certain nothing was watching back. Because after putting this one together, I went and stood at my own back window for a while last night. And I'm still thinking about what I may or may not have seen at the far edge of my yard where the neighbor's fence meets the hedgerow and the light from the street lamp doesn't quite reach. I'm probably wrong about what it was. I'm going to keep telling myself that.